They thought it was over when he walked away and left them with nothing at all. No house, no savings, no backup plan. Just a family standing at the edge of the world with the wind cutting through their clothes, their children asking where they would sleep, and everyone around them quietly assuming this was the moment they would finally break, because no one imagined that losing everything would become the very reason they refused to give up and chose to carve a home out of a dark, forgotten cave where hope was supposed to die. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me where you're watching from, and hit subscribe for more stories where the good guys always win. They thought it was over when he walked away and left them with nothing at all. No house, no savings, no backup plan, just a family standing at the edge of the world with the wind cutting through their clothes, their children asking where they would sleep, and everyone around them quietly assuming this was the moment they would finally break, because no one imagined that losing everything would become the very reason they refused to give up and chose to carve a home out of a dark, forgotten cave where hope was supposed to die. The cave sat hidden behind a bend of rock and overgrown brush, ignored for years because people only saw danger when they looked at it, not shelter, not possibility, and certainly not a future. To everyone else, it was just a hole in the earth, cold and unwelcoming, but to them, it was the only place left that had not already rejected them. The parents stood there in silence, holding their children close, listening to the distant sounds of a world that had already decided they no longer belonged in it. Their youngest asked if monster lived inside, and the question hung heavy in the air because fear was easier than truth, and the truth was that the real monsters had already done their damage and walked away without looking back. Still, the father knelt down, met his child's eyes, and said that sometimes the safest places are the ones everyone else is too afraid to enter. It was not a promise of comfort, but it was a promise of effort, and effort was the one thing they still had. The first steps into the cave felt like crossing a line they could never uncross, because once they went inside, there would be no pretending this was temporary, no pretending help was coming tomorrow. The ground was uneven beneath their feet, and the air smelled of damp stone and old earth. But there was space, and space meant possibility. The mother ran her hand along the rough wall, imagining where they could sleep, where they could sit, and how they might make this place feel less like exile and more like survival. Outside, the sky darkened, and with it came the quiet realization that no one was coming to stop them. No one was coming to save them, and no one was coming to apologize for what had been done. The people who had watched them lose everything had already gone back inside their warm homes, satisfied that the story was finished. What they did not understand was that this was not the end of the story, but the moment it finally became theirs again. As night fell, they gathered what little they had: blankets, a few tools, a bag of food that suddenly felt far more precious than gold, and arranged themselves close together, sharing warmth and whispered reassurances. Fear was still there, sitting quietly in the corners of their minds, but it no longer controlled them, because when you reach the point where there is nothing left to lose, fear loses its power. In its place grew something stronger, something steadier, something that did not need permission to exist. The cave echoed with every movement, every breath, reminding them that this place would demand patience and work, but also honesty, because caves do not hide what you bring into them. If they brought despair, it would multiply, but if they brought determination, it would have room to grow. The parents exchanged a look that said everything words could not, a silent agreement that no matter how hard this became, they would not let this place turn them into people they did not recognize. That night, sleep came slowly, interrupted by unfamiliar sounds and anxious thoughts, but it came nonetheless, and with it came the first small victory. They had survived the day, they had survived the loss, and they had taken the first step toward turning abandonment into independence. Somewhere beyond the cave walls, the person who left them behind believed they had erased a future, but deep inside the stone, a different future was already taking shape, one that would prove that being left with nothing does not mean you are finished. It means you are finally free to build something that cannot be taken away. Morning arrived quietly, filtering into the cave as a thin ribbon of light that crept across the stone floor. And for a brief moment the family forgot where they were until the cold air reminded them that this was no ordinary shelter, but the place they had chosen because there was nowhere else left to go. The children stirred first, confused but unharmed, their eyes adjusting to the unfamiliar walls, and when they realized they had made it through the night, a small sense of relief passed between them like a shared secret. The parents rose slowly, their bodies stiff from the hard ground, yet their minds already racing with questions they could not afford to ignore, because surviving one night was not the same as surviving a week, a month, or an entire season. They stepped outside the cave to look at the land around them, scanning the trees, the rocks, and the distant road, not for help, but for resources, because hope now depended on what they could gather, build, and protect with their own hands. The world outside looked unchanged, almost cruelly indifferent, as if nothing significant had happened at all. And that realization hurt more than the cold ever could. Cars passed in the distance, people went to work, lives continued as usual. While just beyond the trees, a family was starting over from nothing. Still, instead of bitterness, something steadier took root because they understood that waiting for the world to care would only waste the time they needed to act. They divided tasks without argument because desperation has a way of sharpening focus. And everyone knew what needed to be done, even if they had never done it before. The father searched for fallen branches and sturdy wood, testing each piece for strength, while the mother began clearing debris inside the cave, carefully stacking stones and brushing away dirt to create something resembling order. The children were given simple but meaningful jobs, gathering small rocks, carrying leaves, and learning without realizing it that they were not helpless passengers in this situation, but part of the solution. As the hours passed, the cave slowly began to change. Not in appearance so much as in feeling, because the moment effort replaced fear, the space felt less oppressive. Every stone moved, every corner cleaned, was a quiet declaration that this place would not defeat them simply because it was uncomfortable. Sweat replaced shivers, and exhaustion replaced panic. And both felt like progress. At one point, a stranger walked past the edge of the land and stopped, staring openly at the cave and the activity around it, curiosity mixing with disbelief. The family felt the weight of that gaze, the unspoken judgment that followed them everywhere now. But no one stopped work, and no one explained themselves, because they had learned that dignity does not require permission or approval. After a moment, the stranger walked away, shaking their head, unaware that they had just witnessed the foundation of something far stronger than pity. Inside the cave, they marked out spaces with stones, deciding where to sleep, where to store food, and where a small fire could be safely contained. It was not comfort, but it was structure. And structure created calm in a situation that could easily spiral into chaos. The mother paused more than once, imagining how different this would have been if things had gone another way, but she pushed those thoughts aside, knowing that longing for what was lost would only slow what needed to be built. As evening approached, clouds gathered, and the first drops of rain struck the rocks outside, testing their fragile sense of stability. The family moved quickly, securing what they could, pulling belongings further inside and bracing themselves for another night that promised to be harder than the first. When the rain intensified, water ran along the cave walls but did not flood the space they had chosen, and that small mercy felt like a sign that they had chosen wisely, even if by necessity they sat together as the storm raged, sharing food carefully, aware that every portion mattered now, and spoke quietly about the next day, the next week, and what this place might become if they continued. There was no grand optimism, no fantasy of sudden rescue, only a grounded belief. That effort repeated enough times eventually turned survival into stability. The children listened, absorbing the calm in their parents' voices, learning that courage does not always look like confidence. Sometimes it looks like persistence. That night, the rain softened, and the cave settled into silence. The family lay down again, tired but purposeful, knowing they had already done something remarkable without the world noticing. They had not begged, they had not vanished, and they had not surrendered to despair. They had chosen to stay, to build, and to face tomorrow on their own terms. And somewhere in that decision, the cave stopped feeling like a symbol of loss and started becoming proof that even when everything is taken, the will to rebuild can still be stronger than anything left behind. By the third day, the cave no longer felt like an accident of desperation, but like a challenge that demanded respect, because every flaw in the stone, every draft of cold air, and every ache in their muscles reminded the family that survival was not passive but earned through constant attention. The initial shock had faded, replaced by a steady rhythm of work, rest, and planning, and although exhaustion lingered in their bodies, their minds were sharper than they had been since everything was taken from them. The father spent the morning reinforcing the cave's entrance, stacking heavier rocks where the ground sloped inward and arranging branches in a way that blocked the wind without sealing them inside. He tested each placement carefully, knowing that one careless mistake could undo days of effort, because when you build with nothing, precision becomes your greatest resource. The mother organized what little food remained, measuring portions with care, and writing plans in her head for how to stretch supplies without letting hunger take over their lives. The children, no longer frightened as they had been on the first night, moved with purpose, gathering dry leaves for insulation, and learning to recognize which stones were stable enough to move, and which ones should be left alone. What began as simple tasks slowly turned into lessons, because hardship has a way of teaching faster than comfort ever could. They learned patience when something took longer than expected, and learned responsibility when their actions affected everyone else. In the cave outside, the weather shifted again, bringing a sharp wind that carried the sound of distant voices from the road, reminding the family that society still existed just beyond the trees, moving forward without them. That sound stirred something complicated in their hearts, a mix of anger and relief because being forgotten hurt. But being left alone also meant they could rebuild without interference. No one came to offer help, but no one came to drive them away either, and that uneasy balance became another reality they had to accept. Midday brought a moment of tension when a loud crack echoed through the cave as a small section of loose stone broke free near the back wall, startling everyone into silence. Dust filled the air, and the children froze, fear flashing across their faces, but the pair moved quickly, checking for injuries and assessing the damage before panic could take hold. The collapse was minor, but the message was clear, because the cave would not tolerate carelessness, and every decision mattered more than ever. Instead of retreating, they adapted, clearing the fallen stone and reinforcing the weak area with careful support, turning a moment of danger into another lesson in resilience. The children watched closely, learning that fear did not have to mean retreat, and that problems when faced directly often lost their power to overwhelm. By the time the dust settled, the cave felt safer than it had before, not because it had changed, but because they understood it better. As evening approached, they shared stories to pass the time, not stories of what they had lost, but stories of small victories like the fire that stayed lit longer than expected or the way the wine no longer reached their sleeping area. These moments might have seemed insignificant to anyone else, but to them, they were proof that progress was real, even if it came slowly. Laughter returned in brief, quiet bursts, surprising them all with how natural it felt despite everything. That night, as they prepared to sleep, Mother looked around the cave and realized that something important had shifted, because the space no longer felt temporary in the way it once had. It still lacked comfort, still demanded effort, but it no longer felt like a place they were merely hiding in until life resumed. It felt like a place shaped by their choices, their work, and their refusal to disappear. They lay down together, listening to the wind move past the entrance instead of through it, and for the first time since being left with nothing, the future felt uncertain in a way that did not terrify them. They did not know how long they would stay, or what would come next, but they knew this much with certainty, because the cave had already proven it. They were no longer just surviving inside the dark. They were learning how to stay their ground within it, and that knowledge was stronger than any helter they had ever known. The fourth day began with a strange sense of quiet confidence, the kind that only appears after fear has been confronted enough times to lose its sharpest edges. Because while the cave was still cold and the future still uncertain, the family no longer woke up wondering if they had made a terrible mistake. Instead, they woke up thinking about improvements, adjustments, and what could be done next, which was a subtle but powerful shift that changed everything about how they moved through the day. The mother noticed it first as she prepared their small morning meal, realizing she was no longer counting time and hours of survival but in tasks that needed completing before nightfall. She planned how to improve the sleeping area by layering leaves and fabric more efficiently, while also considering how to keep the children warm without exhausting their limited supplies. These thoughts were practical, grounded, and steady, and they replaced the panic that once crowded her mind with every breath. Outside the cave, the father explored further than he had before, moving carefully through the surrounding terrain and memorizing landmarks so he could always find his way back. He discovered a shallow stream not far away, its water clear enough to reflect the sky. And although it would require effort to carry water back and forth, it meant they were no longer entirely dependent on what they had brought with them. That discovery alone lifted a weight he had been carrying silently, because the term meant time, and time meant options. When he returned to the cave with the news, the children reacted with excitement that bordered on relief, because even small discoveries felt enormous when your world had narrowed so suddenly. Together, they worked out a routine for collecting water safely, turning another unknown into something manageable. The process was slow, and the containers were heavy, but every successful trip reinforced the idea that they were capable of adapting, even when circumstances were stacked against them. Midday brought unexpected visitors, not inside the cave, but close enough to remind the family that they were not invisible. A pair of hikers passed nearby, their voices echoing faintly against the rocks, and for a brief moment, the children wondered if they should call out. The parents exchanged a look filled with unspoken questions, weighing pride against necessity, safety against exposure, and the risk of judgment against the chance of assistance. In the end, they stayed silent, not out of shame, but out of caution, because sometimes survival means choosing when to be seen. The decision lingered in the air long after the hikers moved on, forcing the family to confront an uncomfortable truth about how the world treated people who fell outside its neat expectations. They talked openly about it that afternoon, acknowledging the anger, the hurt, and the frustration that came with being left behind, but also recognizing that their worth was not defined by whether strangers noticed them or approved of their choices. That conversation, more than any physical improvement to the cave, strengthened the bond between them. As the day wore on, they focused on making the cave more livable, reinforcing their fire area, smoothing sharp edges of stone, and arranging their belongings with intention rather than desperation. The children took pride in their contributions, showing off small changes they had made and asking thoughtful questions about how things could be improved further. It became clear that they were no longer just enduring this situation. They were learning from it, growing in ways comfort had never required. When evening arrived, the cave glowed softly with firelight shadows, dancing across walls that no longer felt hostile but familiar. The family sat together, sharing a simple meal and reflecting on how much had changed in just a few days. They spoke about the future carefully, not making promises they could not keep, but allowing themselves to imagine possibilities beyond mere survival, which felt like an act of defiance against the circumstances that had brought them here that night. As they settled into their sleeping spaces, the cave held a different kind of silence, one shaped by acceptance rather than fear. The outside world was still uncertain, and the person who had left them with nothing still existed somewhere beyond the rocks, unaware of what was unfolding here. But inside the cave, something important had taken root, because the family no longer saw themselves as victims of abandonment, but as builders of something fragile yet real, proving with every deliberate step that even when stripped of everything, people can still create stability, dignity, and purpose from the most unlikely places. By the fifth day, the cave had become more than a shelter carved out of necessity, because it now carried the mark of routine, intention, and quiet determination, and the family woke with an understanding that survival was no longer their only goal. They had moved past the shock of loss and the scramble to endure, and entered a phase where each decision was shaped by the question of how to last, how to improve, and how to protect what they were building from forces both natural and human. The morning air was colder than usual, slipping through the entrance in sharp currents that reminded them winter was not a distant threat but an approaching reality. The father noticed it immediately and adjusted the barrier they had built, reinforcing weak points and sealing gaps with layered brush and stone. His movements were deliberate, guided by lessons learned the hard way over the previous days, because discomfort had taught him what carelessness never could. Every adjustment made the cave quieter, warmer, and more resistant to the outside world. The mother focused on preserving energy, understanding now that exhaustion could be as dangerous as hunger if left unchecked. She reorganized their supple eyes again, not out of anxiety but out of discipline, ensuring that nothing was wasted and that everyone understood the importance of restraint. She also began teaching the children how to recognize fatigue in themselves and in each other, turning their situation into a living lesson about balance, awareness, and responsibility. Later that day, distant thunder rolled across the sky, and heavy clouds gathered with the promise of harsher weather. Rain followed soon after, pounding against the rocks with a force that tested everything they had done so far. Water traced paths along the cave walls, but this time it flowed where they expected it to, guided by channels they had cleared earlier, and the sleeping area remained dry. That success brought a quiet sense of pride, because preparation had replaced luck, and the cave responded accordingly. As the storm intensified, the family stayed close together, listening not with fear but with focus, ready to act if something shifted or failed. The children watched closely, absorbing how calm could exist even in uncertainty, and how preparedness could turn a threatening situation into something manageable. When the storm finally eased, the silence that followed felt earned, like a reward for patience rather than a temporary pause in the afternoon. Something unexpected happened when another passerby appeared near the edge of the land, slowing as they noticed signs of life near the cave. This time, the family did not immediately retreat silence, but neither did they rush forward. They observed, evaluated, and waited, understanding now that exposure could bring either opportunity or danger. The passerby lingered briefly, then moved on, without approaching, leaving behind a reminder that their existence was becoming harder to hide. That moment sparked a serious conversation as evening approached, one about visibility, safety, and how long they could remain unnoticed. The parents spoke honestly about the risks of staying hidden versus the risk of being seen, acknowledging that neither choice guaranteed security. What mattered most was that any decision they made would be deliberate, not driven by fear or desperation, because they had already learned how costly impulsive choices could be. As darkness settled, the cave felt different again, heavy with thought rather than fear, because awareness had replaced ignorance. The family shared their evening meal slowly, conserving food and savoring the warmth of the fire, while discussing plans for strengthening the entrance further and exploring safer ways to gather supplies. There was no illusion that their situation was easy, but there was clarity. And clarity made endurance possible when they lay down to rest. That night, the sounds of the land felt familiar instead of threatening, and the cave held them steady as the wind moved past its entrance. The person who had left them with nothing still believed their absence meant defeat, still believed this family had been erased from the world. What they could not see was that by the fifth day the family had crossed an invisible line, because they were no longer just surviving a cave, they were defending a home they had built with resolve, foresight, and the unshakable belief that their story was far from over. By the sixth day, something fundamental had changed, not in the cave itself, but in the way the family carried themselves within it, because what had once felt like a temporary refuge born from desperation now felt like a place anchored by intention, memory, and quiet pride. They woke before dawn, not out of fear, but out of habit, listening to the steady breathing of one another and the familiar sounds of the land beyond the entrance. And for the first time since everything was taken from them, the future did not feel like a blank threat but like an unfinished path. The father stepped outside as the sky lightened, taking in the crisp air and the subtle details he had learned to notice over the past days, such as the way the wind shifted before sunrise and how the ground held warmth longer near the rocks. These observations were no longer curiosities but tools, because knowledge of the environment had become as valuable as any possession they once owned. He realized then that they were no longer reacting to circumstances, they were anticipating them, and that realization carried a strength he had not felt in a long time. Inside the cave, the mother quietly prepared the morning routine, careful not to wake the children too early, and paused to look around at what they had built together. The sleeping areas were orderly, the fire space secure, and their supplies arranged with care. And while none of it resembled the life they once had, it reflected something deeper, which was control reclaimed from chaos. She felt a brief ache for what was lost, but it no longer ruled her thought, because grief had finally made room for resolve. When the children woke, they did so with a sense of purpose rather than confusion, asking about the plans for the day and offering ideas of their own. One wanted to help reinforce the entrance further, while another suggested improving the water-carrying process to make it safer and faster. Their ideas were not naive but thoughtful, shaped by days of shared effort, and the parents listened carefully, knowing that confidence built in hardship would stay with them long after this chapter of life ended. Mid-morning brought a moment that tested everything they had learned, when distant voice echoed closer than before, followed by the sound of footsteps approaching the area around the cave. The family moved together instinctively, extinguishing the fire, positioning themselves where they could observe without being seen, and steadying their breathing. Fear flickered, but it did not take control, because preparation had already replaced panic. They waited, alert and silent, until the voices faded and the footsteps moved away, leaving behind only the sound of the wind. Afterward, they spoke openly about what had happened, acknowledging the fear without letting it define them, and discussed how they would handle similar situations in the future. The conversation was calm, practical, and honest, because they understood now that pretending danger did not exist was far more dangerous than facing it directly. They adjusted their plans, reinforced their precautions, and moved on, refusing to let the moment undo the progress they had made. As the day passed, they focused on strengthening what they already had rather than chasing what they did not, improving insulation, reinforcing stone supports, and practicing their routines until each movement felt natural. Work flowed without argument or hesitation, because trust had replaced uncertainty, and everyone understood their role. The cave echoed with quiet cooperation, a sound far more powerful than despair. In the late afternoon, sunlight poured into the entrance at just the right angle, illuminating the interior in a warm glow that transformed the rough stone into something almost welcoming. The family paused to take it in, not because the moment was extraordinary to anyone else, but because it marked how far they had come. Days ago, they had stepped into this cave believing it was the end of their story. And now they stood within it knowing it was the place where their story had changed direction. As night fell, they gathered together once more, sharing a sigh, meal, and reflecting on the lessons they would carry forward, whether they stayed or eventually moved on. They spoke about resilience, about dignity, and about how losing everything had revealed what truly mattered and what never could be taken. There were no grand declarations, only quiet understanding, with felt more real than any promise when they lay down to rest that night. The cave held them steady, not as a symbol of loss but as proof of what people can build when they refuse to disappear. Somewhere beyond the rocks, the person who left them with nothing continued on, unaware that their attempt to erase a future had instead forged one stronger than before. And within the stillness of the cave, the family rested knowing that no matter where life led them next, they would never again believe that having nothing meant being powerless, because they had already turned emptiness into a home.